The OK Corral in Tombstone, Arizona is forever linked to the gunfight that occurred on October 26, 1881, between the Earp brothers, Doc Holliday, and the Clanton and McLaury brothers. The gunfight did not actually take place at the OK Corral, but rather in a nearby vacant lot between Fly's lodging house and a house owned by W.A. Harwood. The Fremont Street entrance to the OK Corral was 90 feet east of where the gunfight occurred. Although no blood had been shed that day on the dirt of the OK Corral, it would become one of the most famous place names in the history of the Wild West. In his book on Wyatt Earp, Stuart Lake would title the chapter about the gunfight as At the OK Corral, and it would eventually be featured on the silver screen in Gunfight at the OK Corral in 1957. All this because of a misnomer. Many historians today like to call it the gunfight near the OK Corral, which preserves the tradition of using the name of OK Corral, but is more accurate. The gunfight in late October of 1881 has been such an important event in American history that it has completely overshadowed a real act of violence that occurred at the OK Corral 9 years later. It was the assassination of one of the most upstanding members of the Tombstone community, a respected doctor, shot down in cold blood on December 30th, 1890. This is the true story of murder at the OK Corral. George Charles Willis came from England to America to practice medicine in the early 1880s. He at first settled in New York City, where he figured prominently in the social as well as the professional circles of the city, being described as both handsome and accomplished. He married Miss Addison, who is also well known in polite New York society, and then, according to some New Yorkers, quietly disappeared. Dr. George Charles Willis had left the upper crust of New York City and moved with his wife to Cochise County, Arizona. In 1886, Dr. Willis was appointed county physician and was paid a salary of $125 per month. Willis was instrumental in the building of a county hospital for Cochise County, the Daily Tombstone newspaper commenting, "The hospital was designed by Dr. Willis and built under his supervision, and we must say that, under his management, it is a credit to this county." On May 29, 1886, Dr. Willis, alongside fellow Tombstone doctor George Goodfellow, helped save the lives of several miners who had succumbed to foul air in a mine. Charlie Leach, Lou Anderson, William Bishop, and Mr. Taylor had entered the Grand Central Mine in order to investigate what damage had been done by a recent fire. The group of men did not return on time, and a rescue party had failed to find them. Many people flocked to the mine in fear that the four men had died of asphyxiation. After a crowd had gathered, Anderson and Bishop emerged from the mine, suffering the effects of either gas or foul air. Dr. George Willis examined and ministered to both Anderson and Bishop. Thankfully, Leach and Taylor also emerged later, also suffering from the effects of foul air. Dr. Goodfellow examined and treated the men and was optimistic that they would recover. The Daily Tombstone newspaper stated, "The alacrity with which Doctors Goodfellow and Willis hurried to the scene is serving of much commendation." Dr. George Willis and Dr. George Goodfellow had made a good team in treating the four miners, and both had great respect from the Tombstone community. The two doctors not only shared the same first name and the location of which they practiced, but both also had connections to the gunfight near the OK Corral. Dr. Goodfellow had treated both Virgil and Morgan Earp for their gunshot wounds after the gunfight, had testified in court on the side of the Earps, and had tried to save Morgan's life after he was shot while playing pool in Campbell and Hatch's saloon. Dr. Willis had been the physician who examined the dying Billy Claiborne after he had been shot by buckskin Frank Leslie in November of 1882. Dr. Willis gave his medical opinion that Claiborne had received the shots from the front, which contradicted the claims that Frank Leslie had shot Claiborne in the back. Billy Claiborne is best remembered for having run away from the gunfight near the OK Corral before any shots were fired. This would not be the last gunshot wound Dr. Willis would have to examine. In September of 1886, Dr. Willis treated a Mexican brought to the county hospital who had been badly wounded by a gunshot in the leg. Dr. Willis had to amputate the leg just below the knee. But besides being a county physician, Dr. George Willis was also the general superintendent and paymaster for a number of mines in the area. Willis had relatives in London, and through their influence, he was appointed to the position, the mines being controlled by an English syndicate. Work at the Old Guard silver mine had been suspended, and Dr. Willis hired 2 men to watch over and protect it. One of these men was Dan Shanklin, who is described as a tramp who had applied to Dr. Willis for work. The company in London that owned the mine had stopped sending money to pay the workers, and so Dr. Willis paid them out of his own pocket for a while, but eventually had to stop. Dan Shanklin was suffering from advanced tuberculosis, and in the past had threatened suicide. Not being paid had mixed his depression with anger, and he began making threats toward Dr. Willis if he did not receive his past wages. When Dr. Willis was told to look out for a dangerous Dan Shanklin, he laughed at the warning. Fred Storer, a hostler who worked at the OK Corral, was the closest eyewitness to what happened on the afternoon of December 30th, 1890. He testified at the coroner's inquest. About 3 o'clock this afternoon, I was filling up the manger with hay as Dr. Willis came in the back way of the OK Corral and asked me to hitch up his horse. After harnessing him, I led him out to the front end of the barn, and when I had him about half hitched up, Dr. Willis stepped into the buggy and sat down. Just as I had completed hitching him up and was passing Dr. Willis the lines, Dan Shanklin stepped up between the shaft and the wheel on the offside of the horse, with a 6-shooter in his right hand, which he advanced over the dashboard and fired at the deceased. I dropped the lines and jumped to one side and saw Dr. Willis fall out of the buggy onto the ground. The horse then started off. I then ran out to the sidewalk and caught him. I heard 5 shots fired, but did not see him firing after the firing of the first shot. Dan Shanklin left the OK Corral, walking down Allen Street towards 3rd Street, where he was stopped and arrested by George Bravin, who at the time was city tax collector, but who would later become deputy sheriff of Cochise County. Dr. Goodfellow was quickly called for, and he attempted to stop the flow of blood. Even though he removed the bullet that had passed through the groin, Willis died from blood loss 2 hours later. Dan Shanklin would be tried for the murder of Dr. George Willis in Tombstone. On May 28, 1891, the jury were unable to agree on a verdict and were discharged. 11 members of the jury stood for acquittal, and 1 stood for conviction. Shanklin's defense had been somewhat successful in their case that it had been justifiable homicide. Besides bringing a number of friends to court to testify on the good character of Shanklin, the defense introduced several witnesses who said that Dr. Willis had threatened to kill Shanklin and that he was armed for him. As printed in the Arizona Daily Star, Mrs. Ben James testified that he had made a professional visit to her house and that he had a pistol in his pocket. She asked him why he was carrying it, and he said he had trouble with a man, but it would be all over very soon. John McMahon testified that Dr. Willis told him that he was going to fix Shanklin and that he might tell Shanklin so. He did tell him, and Mrs. James told him what had occurred in her presence, and Shanklin thereupon went and killed Willis. Finally, on June 13th, 1891, the court received a verdict. The second trial of Dan Shanklin for the murder of Dr. George C. Willis in December last ended today with a verdict of manslaughter. The case was the most hotly contested in the annals of Cochise. The verdict was compromised on account of the defendant being in the last stages of consumption. Shanklin was sentenced to 10 years imprisonment. Soon after Dr. George Willis had been killed, his wife's brother came to Tombstone to help her in her grief. She disposed of her furniture at a private sale and wrapped up her business affairs. Willis's wife and children left Tombstone on January 14th to go back to New York. The body of Dr. George Willis was taken to New York City, where the funeral took place. The tombstone epitaph had this to say about the passing of Dr. Willis. This sudden taking off has cast a gloom over the entire community, and the sympathy of everyone goes to the widow and children. Dr. Willis came to Tombstone several years ago and has held many positions of trust. He has been county physician 2 different terms and took a great pride in the county hospital and grounds. He was a man of very positive likes and dislikes. His friends were firm ones, and he often remarked that he had but few friends, but preferred to make few and have them true ones than to make lukewarm friends of everybody. He was a man who was not intended for frontier life. The repeated warning that he had received from friends to beware of his slayer were not heeded, and had the same threats been made against most any other person, the result would have been different. I would like to give a special thanks to the Arizona Historical Society, specifically the Arizona History Museum, Library, and Archives, who were able to locate and provide the 4 photos concerning Dr. Willis, his family, and his horse and carriage at the OK Corral. You might be wondering why photographs of Dr. Willis's carriage and horse at the OK Corral exist. This is answered from an article in the Tombstone Weekly Epitaph of February 22, 1891. Before her departure, Mrs. Willis had photographs made of the scene of the murder, showing the position of the horse and phaeton at the time of the shooting. This was probably done to provide evidence at the trial. I would also like to thank the Cochise County Historical Society and the Douglas Williams Home Museum in their assistance.